And I see Ashley just joined us. Good. Okay, now I want to know who the trades group is. Did that person leave us? Who's trades group? Hi, Ann. At least for now, if you'll just kind of unmute yourselves and say something to me. Hi. I'm glad you're with us, Ann.
Hi, Becky.
Thank you. Hi, Mark. Oh, well, Lynn's left us. Okay, now who is trades group? Hi, Andrea.
Hello, Becky.
Now, who is that? Trades group.
This is Sean and Gary and Jeff Moretti.
Oh, okay. We got us all together. Hey, guys. I'm glad you joined us.
We're glad to be here.
Good. Okay, I see we have several more joining. Hi, Warren. I see you're there. But I'm going to move on, try to make the best of our time. Thank you for joining us for Don't Judge, Assess Instead. And I have several things I'm going to say about that title, and hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense to you. Robin Jones is with us on this particular session, and she's going to be moderating for me. I see she's already turned on the recording for us. So let's get started. But a couple of ground rules as far as I'm concerned. Those of you who may know that I expect you to participate. Yes, I have some things to share, but I think it's equally and maybe even more important to have you share with each other. And so there are going to be times that I'll ask you to go into the chat and share your answers there and try to get some feedback from you that way. So please do that, and Robin will help me stay on course here. So let's start talking about don't judge and assess instead. In order to get a feel for where we are, I see your names, I know who's joined us, and I'm glad you're doing that. But if you'll go very quickly into your chat and tell me and your peers, and let me explain this one question, because it for most of you may be a very short answer. I want you to type in, if you would, your two most often used summative evaluation strategies. Now, I think most of you know you've either been in some of my sessions or the academy and other things. Summative evaluation, that is, what is it you do when you go to evaluate your students? What things do you use most often? Just type that in, if you will. Okay, Mark, thank you. Unit exams and quizzes. Written exams during class. Okay, we're going to come back to what that during, Anthony. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, tests and papers. Some of the same things. All right, we've got Christy and Danny over in nursing with their evaluation tools. Tests and labs. Okay, we're seeing some of the same things here. These are summative tools. Learning exercises. We might talk a little about that. Okay, I see David has joined us. Any of the rest of you type in for me? What are the two things you use most often in your class? Labs and performance. Obviously, yeah, we're talking about our trades group there. Lots of observation of performance, I would assume, there as an evaluation tool. Okay, thank you for those. Robin will be looking at that. We've got some group projects. Okay. Clinic, labs, and projects. Okay, over in Cosmo. You can tell in our psychomotor areas, and I noticed there are a number of you that actually are in our psychomotor area. We've got lots of labs and those kinds of things, which is to be expected. Okay, let's move ahead a little bit, because even though I've got these early slides that indicate grading, the real topic today is not going to be grading. We're going to talk about it a little bit to make a point. But to start, I want to tell a story. Many of you know I like to tell anecdotes. And this is a true one, so I'll do it very quickly, but I want to make a point here. A number of years ago, and sort of in the midst of my career in education, I assumed a newly created role. Here we go. I assumed a newly created role in the state that was called the Teacher Observer Evaluator. Now, specifically, that role had two responsibilities. One of them was to provide support for beginning teachers, and the second one was to ultimately make a decision about whether teachers in the state earned a license to teach in North Carolina. So it didn't take me very long to understand that there were two very different roles involved. But there was one particular incident that occurred that brought it all to life for me. At the time, I was observing this one day. I walked into a high school classroom to observe a beginning teacher. At the time, they were 90-minute classes over a 6 weeks period of time. And y'all excuse me, I'm gonna cancel that video. I don't like looking at myself. But I went in, I just happened to pick a day that in this 90-minute period, this young teacher was administering a, I guess he would call it a unit test, a 6 weeks test, I suppose it would have been called. And so as I stayed to observe, and as I did so, I noticed very quickly, and some of you may have seen this in your own teaching experience, very quickly that the students began to raise their hands to ask questions about directions, and in some cases actually ask questions about the content. In other words, they wanted the teacher to give the answer. And in a number of cases, they began within minutes just turning the paper over or quickly going through it and turning it in. And so that's kind of the way it went throughout this rather large classroom. So after the 90 minutes was up and class ended, I spent a couple of minutes afterwards with this teacher to schedule a post-conference for the next day. And in broaching the subject of the student frustration, because you could really sense the air of frustration that was in the room, I asked how much weight this particular unit test carried in this 6 weeks. Anybody want to guess what he told me? Anybody? 16%, okay. He actually looked at me and said that that particular unit test was 100% of their 6 weeks grade. So we scheduled our post-conference. Yeah, right, Anthony, oh my. That's kind of the way I felt. We scheduled our post-conference for the next day, and I left that knowing that somehow I had to find a way to get him to understand the importance of more than one test that was a 6 weeks grade, and providing some kind of different assessment. So when I went back the next day, I sat with him, and he, of course, knew who I was and what my role was in the big picture of his career. And so I asked him how he would feel if I came in and observed him one time and then made that decision as to whether he would ever have a license to teach in the state. And of course, he didn't like that idea at all. And he knew that I was actually supposed to be there to provide feedback for him and mentor him throughout the year. And so, why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because I think it made clear to him that as an instructor, you always have two roles when it comes to working with students. Now, in that case, he was a teacher, but he was my student. And so I tell that because I want you all to understand that you are observer evaluators. You know, using that same terminology, you are an observer and an evaluator in your class. So let's talk about what that means when we talk about grading. We're going to go over to this. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of grading. Grading's been around a long time. It actually started with Harvard University many years ago, and we're not going to go into the history of it entirely. But I think it's important to look at a couple of quotes. These came from a document that I'm actually going to send to all of you. Notice that first quote from 1986. That was 31 years ago. 31 years ago, we were talking about the fact that when we give grades in school, we emphasize quantitative aspects, depress creativity, foster fear, and undermine interest. That's a rather bleak, negative view of grading students. But we all know that you have to grade. I don't want anybody to leave this session and say that Beckie Collins said we don't have to grade students, because that's not true. Notice 31 years later, it's likely that grades will continue to be the currency of formal teaching. And we know that's true. We are still grading students. But notice that last sentence. The most important consideration for instructor about grading is to be skeptical about what that grade means. So again, we don't want to focus on your grading students. I know you have to do it. Everybody knows you have to do it. But we want to look at the observer part of your role. Now, let's talk about when you do give grades in your class, the purposes of grading. You'll see on this screen, if you're watching, you've got a yay and a nay. So I'm going to pose a question, and I want you to give me a yay or a nay. Does everybody know how to do that in your chat box? If you don't, you go down to your little emoticon. If you go down to your emoticon, you'll see a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So as we talk about this, think about your classes, whether they be seated or online, either one. Think about your classes and these four purposes of grading. The first one is we grade students as a means of providing feedback for them. How does grading provide feedback to help students understand and improve their deficiencies? When does this occur? So you think about your class. Do you think that the grade you give them provides feedback to help them improve? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, we got one that feels like they're doing the right thing. Okay. When does that feedback occur? Sometimes. Okay, John, you don't feel like it always improves their deficiencies. Okay. Others? Are you getting feedback? Or are you putting a 85 on the work and that doesn't necessarily improve them? That's what we're asking here. Okay, Anthony says what he does gives him, makes him aware. All right. Somebody does the grading weekly. Good, Ayumi. All through the semester. All right, grading all through the semester. Good. All right, let's go to the second one. This is kind of an interesting one that I've been wondering about. Giving grades as a motivator of student effort. Do you think that your grades motivate students to actually learn the material? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Some, okay. I assume that means some students are motivated by that. Okay. Most of you feel like they're motivated when you give them that grade. All right, I want to pause for a minute and please raise your hand and speak because I'd like some feedback on this one. When you give a grade, Anthony says iffy. When you give a grade, which of your students are most motivated by your grades? Oh, I just saw the answer. Who are the ones that you motivate most by the grades that you give? Okay, all right. Our trades group says those that are worried about their GPA. Okay, so that would make me wonder, are they more worried about the GPA or they're learning the material? Okay, yeah, nursing students. Andrea, thank you. High achievers. Yeah, there's lots of research out there that says that grades, now I'm not talking about activities, I'm talking about the actual grades. Grades themselves tend to motivate the high achievers more. Students who struggle are not necessarily motivated by the grade that you put on a piece of work, whatever that work may be, a test or whatever it may be. Particularly students who feel as if that there's not much hope that they can get a certain grade. Yeah, John says it's often those students who are already motivated, high achievers. So while, yeah, it does motivate some, I think what we have to consider here is that the grade alone may not be reaching those students who need something to motivate them to work and master the content. Now, I see a number of you are talking about those that need them for certification exams and the ability to get a license or a certificate in their careers. Now, that's a different kind of motivation. Yeah, the grade is involved, but certainly there's a more intrinsic motivation there. All right, now I'm really interested in this next one at the college level. Okay, see some that work for the grades, but when it gets right down to doing the work, Brian says they're hesitant. All right, now grades as a tool for comparing students. Are you concerned about, here's the question, are you concerned about comparing students when you give grades? I mean, do you compare the performance of your students when you're giving grades? Yes or no? Yep. No, no, good, no. It's no concern for you. Okay. Some say yes. Okay, Andrew says no, she's not worried about comparing. What we're actually talking about here is the what I think is becoming, eventually becoming a little antiquated notion of grading on a curve. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a situation yourself as a student where you had a professor who actually graded on a curve. I have had. I've been around long enough for that to happen. And the whole notion of that is a norm reference grade, which basically looks at aptitude of students rather than looking at whether students are mastering the material or achieving. And so there was a time, particularly at the university level, where students were already plotted on what they call the normal curve. So does anybody do that? First of all, speak up if you do and why you might do that. Okay. Thank you, David, for saying that, because I know as an English teacher, I have done that same thing. It's very difficult when you're working on a subjective kind of assessment, sometimes not to compare students. I think the point there in looking at grading as a tool for comparing is that we don't do that as much anymore. Does the grade, though, ultimately, in comparison to others, matter to somebody? Are there those out there who do look at those grades that way? Those in the trades areas or allied health areas might know what I'm referencing here. Yeah, I agree that grades curves are unfair. It's not really looking at the mastery of the subject, but grades do matter at some level. What do you mean by that, Anthony? What do you think? To whom does that matter when they look at comparing students? There you go. That's kind of what I was looking at. At some point for students, whether it's students transferring to higher ed, or in the case of many of you, I suspect it has to do with employers. They do ultimately look at grades. I know as a human resource director myself, when I was looking at employment of teachers, one of the things we looked at were transcripts. So at some point, there does become a comparison in terms of grades. But I think, as most of you have said, that as far as your perspective for giving a grade, it's more about, have students mastered the content? Have they mastered the content? Yeah, John, that's a good one. Graduate studies, when you get to that higher level. But for us, we're looking at the objectives that we have for our courses, and do students actually master those objectives? And they can do that without being compared to other students. So I don't think we look at that one. The last one here is, do you give your grades as an objective evaluation of what students know? Do they provide you reliable information about student knowledge? No. Yes or no? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Somebody says always my goal. Yeah. Mark, I hope so. Okay, now that's not a trick question, but what I'm trying to do is get you to think about, when you gather information from students to determine whether they've actually gained knowledge of your material, are you confident that that's an objective evaluation? Some of their knowledge or Thank you, Warren. If I structure the assessment properly, and that's what we're talking about, we're going to talk about that kind of thing for some of the remainder here. It starts with, Warren says the burden is on him. And I would agree with that. At the beginning, the burden is to create assessment activities, whatever they may be, and then grade them accordingly to ensure that you have developed that objective evaluation. Now, what this is basically saying, if you look at these last two purposes of grading, is that rather than looking at aptitude, that you can take any of your students, regardless of their level of aptitude, and if they're taught appropriately, if the assessments are assigned appropriately, then any student should be able to master the content in your course. Now, yes, some will probably master it more so than others, as just a general function of assessment. All right, thank you. Now, from this point on, I'm not going to talk about grades. You're not going to hear me talk about grades. I don't want to hear about grades. We want to talk about assessment. I don't know if any of you were in the earlier session this morning with Elizabeth Pitts and Jamie and Fernando. But if any of you did sit in on that, you heard them talking about course alignment and making sure that you started with clearly delineated objectives, course and module, and then create your activities and assessment to align with those particular objectives. So I'm kind of picking up from where they were and where they stopped at. And we want to talk about what we really mean when we talk about assessing the students in your class. And you won't see anywhere on this particular slide that I have up by Angelo and Cross anything about grades. You won't see anything there that says grades. Assessment serves two purposes. It's for you, first of all. You have to assess in order to know where your students are and whether they are mastering the material in your course. And it's actually designed also to let you know how effective you are. I hope that faculty understand that and use the assessments in the class as a means of determining their own teaching effectiveness. It does provide a measure for looking at your goals. I realize, as many of you heard this morning, that you're given a set of course objectives, and then from there you develop your module objectives. And we all hope every time we do that, no matter what it is, we hope that we have developed achievable objectives. And that's what that third bullet's talking about. It lets you know, am I moving in the right direction, or have I perhaps created an objective that we can't accomplish? So it's a means of evaluating the whole issue of the goals in the class. And then the last one, which is really to me the most important definition of classroom assessment, whether that be seated or online, is a continuous flow of accurate information, the key word being continuous. So my question then becomes, which of these are you doing? You see on the screen, there's two types of assessment. And I know some of you have heard me talk about this, but let's go back and review just a little bit. You have two types of assessment. Which of these two types was my high school teacher engaging in? From my little anecdote earlier. Speak up if you will. I'd love to hear some of you talk. Which of these two types of assessment was my high school teacher using? The teacher that I described earlier.
Summative.
Absolutely. That's all he was doing, was giving a grade. A grade. A one test, 6 weeks grade. So from that, and I know that sounds critical. I was actually more shocked than anything else. There reaches a point when you do have to give a summative grade, but summative is typically considered after instruction has occurred. So whatever the lesson, whatever the module, whatever the unit, at the end of it, we know there has to be some assessment of the learning that has occurred. That's your summative. It's accountability for you, because you are all held accountable for providing a final judgment, if you will. You're judging at that point. You are judging and assigning a grade. Now, assessment for learning occurs prior to and during, and I saw some of you posted that in your chat, that you actually assess throughout the semester, or you assess during the instruction that's occurring. That is formative assessment. And by far, that is the most helpful assessment for a student. You have to do both, and you're right, absolutely. Everybody has to do both. What you hope is that you do more formative than you do. All right, somebody speak.
Yeah, Becky, I got a question. On this teacher that you looked at, you said you came into him whenever he was given uh, the exam for the end of the 6-week period. Did you have an
Right.
opportunity at some point to engage with him at some other opportunity to see that maybe he was providing some of this formative assessment, or was it one of those things that wasn't possible because of the way that you read the students or whatever? You understand what I'm asking you?
Okay. No, no, I know what you're saying. Yeah, I can answer that question. That was not the first time I had ever seen that instructor.
Okay, that's what
The
basically,
way
because I mean, the way,
that
go ahead, I'm sorry.
what in that situation, with that particular role that I was filling, we had done lots of training prior to the observation round beginning. And then, but to answer that question in another way, after leaving that day, the first thing I did was go to the school principal's office and pull the file of lesson plans for that instructor to see if there had been other types of assessment. Sadly, there had not been much of anything. But the good news is, let me just finish that story since you asked that question. The good news is, we throughout the year we worked on all of those things, and that instructor did earn a license to teach in North Carolina. I'll just end the story that way. Um, although the contract for the school system was not renewed. But let's go back to let's go back to formative assessment. Now, the purpose of formative, and I know that I know many of you, and I know the kinds of things that you do. So I'm confident that you do use formative, but let's keep in mind why you should be doing it. Obviously, the first thing is that you want students to master the content. And in order to do that, they have to engage with the content. They have to, in some way, manipulate the content of your course. And they have to engage with you and with each other. In the case of this young man that I was describing, there was very little engagement. It was kind of all a one-way delivery of material. Formative assessment is to provide motivation. If feedback is given as it should be and in the manner that it should be given with formative assessment, it should be motivating for students. Even a student who may not be achieving at the level at which they would like to perform and you would like to have them perform, but it can become a progressive state. And obviously then the ultimate goal is to improve teaching and learning. Now Mark has a question here. Is there a difference in effectiveness of graded versus ungraded formative assessments? That's a great question. I'd like to have your peers kind of chime in on this as well, if you would. Mark, I've had lots of instructors in the academies and in other settings ask about that. If we call formative assessment an ungraded assessment because we're not judging, we're not making judgments, I've had instructors say that students really don't do it. They don't want to engage in those activities, or they don't complete the assignments that are formative. And I understand that. I do think that happens. I think there's a way. I know there is. There's a way of using formative activities during instruction, and that can mean in the classroom or as assignments outside of the classroom, that you don't actually attach a punitive grade to, that you offer credit for completing the activity. And I know there are instructors here on Coastal's campus that do exactly that. You know, they assign them and they expect the activities to be completed, which of course is much more easily done in a seated classroom because you're there to observe it and to facilitate it. But not attach a grade to it. Don't place great weight on formative assessments. the purpose again is to allow you to see if students are progressing and what you can do differently to help them. Oh, that's a great point. You can use those formative assessments for your attendance in an online class. I know instructors who do exactly that. Not only does it serve as the attendance check, which you all have to do, but that it serves another purpose, and that is to give you feedback about what students are learning or if they're learning. So as we move through this next part on some sample formative assessments that don't have to be graded, think about that. Think about the kinds of things that you can use. Very quickly, though, I know that some of you are aware of this, but just from looking at the attendees in this particular session, what you're assessing may kind of different here, depending on what you teach. Generally, when we assess students, we are assessing these 5 things, or at least some of these 5 things. I see student midpoint evaluations. Good. That's a form of formative assessment, I would assume. All right, now, general content knowledge. I dare say all of you probably assess that one, no matter what you teach, no matter what your area. In some cases, you are assessing thinking skills, reasoning proficiency. Again, I want to believe that all of you somewhere in your assessments are incorporating that. I may be wrong. You can give me some feedback on that. Then obviously discipline-specific skills. In other words, performance skills. And that we've got our trades group listening to us, and we've got Susan with medical lab. We've got some of you in Cosmo and some in nursing. And so those are our psychomotor performance discipline areas. So one would assume that you are assessing both formatively and summatively in a manner that changes for those targets. Some of you, all of them, good. And truthfully, I think we should always be grading all 3 of the domains. Some of you actually look for a student's ability to create some kind of final product. Again, be that a more cognitive domain or maybe psychomotor. And then some of you are looking for personal development and attitude. Again, I'm hopeful that's true. With all of, because here at the college level, we are preparing students generally to go either in the workforce or furthering their career in whatever chosen field they have at a higher education level. So attitude, the affective domain and attitude becomes very important. I think this provides us a comprehensive list of the things you're assessing. And this, I assume, is how you do it. Look, if you will, at this grid. There are 4 categories generally of assessments that you use. Some of you probably more than others, depending on your discipline. Look at that, and if you will, in the chat box, check the one that you think you probably assessed most often, that you use as a tool most often. Selected response, go through them. Selected response, of course, are more your short answer, multiple choice. Students just objectively select an answer. Extended writing is exactly what that says. Those of you that have students writing reports and papers and essays and that kind of thing. Performance assessment is based on observations. You're actually helping your students complete skills or creating some kind of product. And then personal communication is when you assess your students through questioning and interviews and logs and oral exams. So which do you use most often? I'm really interested in this one. Selected response, extended written, okay? Performance assessment, performance, selected, and performance. Okay. Which do you use? And I'm not talking here either summative or both summative and assessment. We've got mathematical solutions. That's right, John. That's more your written, right. Personal communications and performance, selected responses and extended written, selected response performance. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of what I might expect to see given what I know your disciplines are. Primarily selected response, but some extended written. Okay. Oh, okay. Ayumi, that's good. Selected and then the actual singing or personal communication. All right. All right. Now that you know that the types that you use most often, and you don't have to answer this, I want you to think about it for a minute. These things that you've just indicated that you use, are you grading them so they become a heavily summative evaluation? Or are you using these things in a formative manner? And again, I just want you to reflect on that for a minute and think about when you give that selected response, or when you are observing them do something, are you putting a lot of weight to it, which makes it really a heavily graded, or are you using those items just to check for progress and to provide feedback for students? That's what distinguishes the two. Obviously, the preferred answer might be that you do both at various times. I give numerical grades with feedback. Okay. Could be graded, not graded. All right. Anthony, that's exactly what I was just saying, that I'm not really posing a trick question to you here. Point I'm making is that oftentimes we do grade them. We put a grade, like Warren has just said, we do grade them, but keep in mind that you can use some of these very same things in a formative manner. You can use some of these very same activities, be it observing students performing a task, or be it creating some kind of crossword puzzle or filling in the blanks. Those things can all become formative in nature, where students feel less stress thinking that it's going to attach some heavily weighted grade. Okay, Brian says his lab grade is used as a formative measure with an opportunity to improve it weekly. Oh, that's great, Brian. Mark, that kind of goes back to your earlier question, that you can actually grade something, but then when you have students have the opportunity to come back and improve it, it actually becomes formative. So for those of you who do that, for those of you who have students redo assignments, and particularly, I was reading just recently an article that came from one of our instructors here on campus, who actually shared the article with me, that talks about that very thing, that it becomes very progressive, that you start an assignment, whatever it may be, written, it could be like an essay, or it could be any of these assignments that we see here, and students can resubmit showing the areas where they have taken your feedback. And I think that's great, that they actually are showing you how they've taken your feedback and corrected the work. And so ultimately, when it's graded, if you've provided the right kind of feedback and helpful feedback, and they've taken advantage of that feedback, then ultimately the graded part should show that there's been growth, that they've mastered it. So consider that. Consider taking some of these very same kinds of things that you do, that you might normally say, I use these to grade and give that final judgment, and look at them in a formative light. Multiple summative assessments. Circle back through the material. There you go. Exposing them to the material they need to learn. Right. Okay, David, that's right. Test reviews with very low state participation grade. All right, that again is exactly, David, what I was saying earlier, that things like having students do test reviews or study guides or those kinds of activities, be it online again or seated, where you may give credit of some sort, but not any high stakes grading, that becomes formative in nature. And then it ultimately helps when they get to the time that they do have that final graded activity, whatever that activity may be. All right, the last few minutes I want to go. All right, so we're talking here about not grading, not testing, not any of that. We want to know how you ensure mastery without a focus on evaluation. So I'm going to give you a typical scenario and see where you fill in the blanks. All right, so you have your lesson, you have your module objectives, because we all know it has to start with those module objectives. And then your next task is to decide two things. First of all, what assessments will I use to determine whether those objectives have been mastered? And then what activities will I use to get students to that point? In other words, unlike my high school teacher that I described earlier, you don't lecture, 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 give a 6 weeks test. Because what's left out, of course, in all of that, well, in that case, the objectives were also left out. But what's left out is any engagement with the material. So as a means of working toward mastery learning, kinds of activities or engaging activities do you use, either online or seated, or maybe both, without a focus on evaluation? Give me one example of something that you do. It doesn't carry a grade, but it engages students with the material. All right? And then I'm going to show a slide and see if any of you have used them. All right, who's going to start for me? What do you do to engage them? What kind of activity or assessment, if you want to use that word? Okay, there you go. That's a good example, Anthony. First of all, you're having students work in groups. That's the type of engagement that's important. And then they are taking that material, manipulating, again, using my word, those events. Now, that's an activity that's not a major grade. That's the piece in the middle of objective and final assessment. And that's what formative is. It's what do you do from the beginning of the objectives and then when you assess them. Group discussions. Okay, good. Troubleshooting issue. Oh, that's my trades group. Okay. Right. Having them work together to troubleshoot. Again, you're observing that. They're working with it, but you're not making that a major grade. That makes it formative. That makes it a formative assessment. Now, anybody else? Activities are given a prompt and working group. Think, pair, share. Thank you, David. That's one on my list. Students create games we play. Right, okay, the trades group. You're there watching and providing support. And then you grade, John, I see what you've done. You grade them in front of the class or have the students assess the solution. Peer evaluation, that's another good form of formative assessment. Scavenger hunt, thanks, Mark. That is a formative assessment. All right. Now, the challenge, and we've all faced this challenge in the last year, actually a little more than a year now, when suddenly everything went online. So I noticed that some of the things you have listed here as the assessments that you use, particularly the formative assessments that you've used, um, appear to be maybe more specific to the seated class. So one of the challenges now that we have to face is, can you do some of those same things in the online classroom? And in those last few minutes, and the last slide, I promise, these are formative assessments. I know that some of you have heard me talk about these particular types of formative assessments, but specifically in the past, you've heard me talk about them in the seated classroom. So look at this list. I think David listed Think, Pair, Share for us right here. I think it was Anthony that talked about gaming, creating games as a formative assessment. First of all, look at it and ask, if you will, or put in the chat, any of these that you are familiar with and that you've used. And do you think you can use them in the online classroom? Because the answer is you can use all of these in the online classroom. Okay, the trades group, you know my 3-2-1, right, guys? Muddiest point and debates, all of which can be done in this online setting. Yep. All right. Anybody else? That's fine if you're not familiar with them. I mean, we can make it that way. One says he uses minutes paper. Okay. Student generated test questions. That's one easily done online as well as in the seated classroom. All of these, and as I went through the many list of formative tools that can be used, I deliberately pulled some that I know can translate into the online environment if you happen to find yourself in that environment. Now, some of them do require that you use groups in Blackboard, but most of them really don't even have to do that as long as you can use Collaborate. Collaborate will allow you to do any of these. Are there questions about what any of these might be? I'll be happy to explain them. Anybody? Okay, one of my favorites, as my trades group knows, is 3-2-1. It's a very simple, quick assessment that allows you to get feedback, and it's formative. It's formative. It allows you to get feedback. You can give students credit for doing it, but it's certainly not something that you would grade. I think that holds true for minute papers and muddiest points, one-sentence summaries. All of those kinds of things are ways for you to assess, even daily, the student mastery of content. Obviously, discussion forums allows you to create what might otherwise be a classroom discussion. Any questions about any of these? Any questions about anything in today's session? Okay, finally, then I would close by saying you have to grade. We all know we have to grade. But I would ask you to step outside of the role of the evaluator and become the observer of learning. Just back in my earlier example, you are the observer evaluator, and the dominant role really should be the observer. And to do that, you have to do things like this. You have to engage as you're building your course map and building your course. You have to build in activities and assessments that are not a test. They're not a heavily graded assignment or project, but formative tools that allow you to determine learning as you go through the course. Thank you, Chef, for your comment. You're welcome, certainly. I love you too, trades. I'll get over to see you. All right, thank you so much. And y'all have a wonderful fall semester. Oh, and I'm going to put a plug in. I'm this is shameful. This is shameful, but that's okay. Um, we're doing a lot of work this semester, professional development, the Academy for Online Instructors. We're doing an advanced academy for online instructors that focuses on quality matters. And that's something that's helpful whether you teach seated or online. So be looking for those opportunities. Talk to your division chairs. Thank you. I'm going to sign off.